Today, we're diving into a pretty staggering economic story. We're asking, how did India, once a global manufacturing powerhouse, become an agricultural supplier for the British Empire? Well, let me tell you, it didn't happen by accident. This was a deliberate, total rewiring of an entire economy. To really get a sense of just how massive this change was, you just have to look at this comparison. Think about it. In 1750, India is a global producer. It's famous for its amazing finished goods, its world-class handicrafts. But fast forward just 150 years, and the economy is, well, it's almost unrecognizable. It's now a supplier of raw materials for British factories, it's importing manufactured goods, and its own agricultural sector is completely overburdened. The change is just incredible. So that's the big question for us today, right? How on earth does an economic powerhouse get so completely rewired in just a century and a half? Like I said, this wasn't an accident. This was a process. This great rewiring was basically a colonial blueprint with two main parts. And together, these two parts systematically reshaped the entire Indian economy to serve British interests. So let's break down the first one.
First up is the total transformation of agriculture. This is really the story of how India's farms went from growing food for Indian people to basically producing factory feed for industries thousands and thousands of miles away.
The official term for this is the commercialization of agriculture, but the key word here, and you really have to remember this, is forced. This was not some natural evolution of the market. Historians have called it a colonially induced market dependency. So how exactly did they force farmers to do this? Well, the main tools they used were these new land revenue systems. So under one system, the permanent settlement, landlords had every reason to push peasants to grow cash crops. In another system, the Ryotwari system, the government put the pressure on directly. But you know what? The result was always the same. You had to pay your revenue in cash, and to get that cash, farmers had no choice but to stop growing food for themselves and start growing crops they could sell. And who was buying all these cash crops? It wasn't local markets, that's for sure. The demand was coming directly from British industry. We're talking about cotton for the huge textile mills in Lancashire, jute for factories in Dundee, and indigo for dyeing all those British textiles. Indian agriculture was essentially becoming, as one historian put it, just an appendage of British industry. And we're not talking about a small change here. The scale of this shift was enormous. By the end of the 19th century, in some parts of India, a full quarter of all the land being farmed was used for these commercial crops. That's a quarter of the land that used to grow food, now growing inputs for factories. And the consequences, well, they were tragic. As more and more land was shifted away from growing food, and sometimes food was even being exported during shortages, India was hit by a series of absolutely catastrophic famines. This rewiring of agriculture had a staggering, devastating human cost. But people didn't just take this lying down, not at all. There was intense resistance. The famous Indigo revolt is a really powerful example of this, where farmers in Bengal just rose up against being forced to grow indigo. It's proof that this whole process created a massive unrest and hardship, not prosperity for the people. Okay, so that's one side of the coin, a completely rewired agricultural sector. But that was happening at the exact same time as another huge change: the systematic dismantling of India's traditional industries. This process is known as de-industrialization, and the definition here is super important. It wasn't just that the old industries were declining, it was that no new, modern Indian industries were growing to take their place. So the end result was just a net destruction of the country's industrial capacity. So how did this even happen? Well, a huge part of it was incredibly discriminatory trade policy. Think about it. World-famous Indian textiles faced crippling tariffs, sometimes up to 75 or 80% just to enter Britain. But at the same time, British machine-made goods could come into India with a tiny duty of just 2.5% or sometimes nothing at all. It wasn't a fair fight, it was a fixed one. And the result of this? A complete and total collapse. In 1750, India controlled about a quarter of the entire world's textile exports. By 1900, that share had just plummeted to less than 2%. The world's textile workshop had been reduced to a historical footnote. And the fallout from this was just devastating. Millions of skilled artisans, weavers, spinners, metal workers, they all lost their jobs. And with nowhere else to go, they were forced into agriculture, which put even more pressure on land that was already strained. Thriving industrial cities like Dhaka and Surat just went into decline. So you see, we have these two massive transformations going on, but they weren't happening in isolation. They were two parts of the same machine, and they were working together to create a brand new economic reality for India, a blueprint for dependence. And this is that blueprint in action. You can see how they're mirror images. Commercialization turns India into an exporter of raw materials. De-industrialization turns it into an importer of finished goods. One process creates chaos in the countryside, the other causes decay in the cities. Put them together, and they forged an economy that was completely dependent on Britain. You know, the historian Bipan Chandra just sums it up perfectly with this quote. Colonialism distorted both agriculture and industry, creating a dual crisis. It wasn't one problem, but two interconnected crises that were feeding off each other. And the result was the fundamental rewiring of the entire Indian economy. And that leaves us with a final thought. This isn't just about history, right? This is a case study in how entire economies can be deliberately reshaped. And it makes you wonder. It raises a really powerful question for all of us. How do the economic blueprints that were drawn up in the past continue to shape the destinies, the challenges, and the opportunities of nations all over the world today?